So hello and welcome to this webinar on Life After the Lifetime Allowance Part 2. Some of you may have seen me talk about this before. I did a webinar, well, I first did a bit sort of following the budget, but then I did it a bit after the Lifetime Allowance in our autumn roadshows. So some of you may have even seen it in person, which we then also broadcast that as a webinar afterwards, which is still available on the info centre on the website. So that was sort of talking about primarily the draft legislation that we had, which came out in July. What we've now had recently is the autumn finance bill, which has made some changes to what we had in July, and there's a whole load more legislation as well. So we now have a better idea, or a more complete picture, if you like, of what Life After the Lifetime Allowance will look like, taking benefits from April 2024. So it's going through that. Basically, that is the purposes of this webinar today. So let's go back and have a little bit of a timeline to see how we got to this point. So it all started back in March, which seems like quite a long time ago, really, now, in terms of what we've been through since, when we had the announcement in the budget that the lifetime allowance was going to be removed from April 2024. So that was announced, and then about a week later, we had the draft finance number 2 bill, as it was called then, and that dealt with the changes that came into effect from 6th of April this year. So basically, that dealt with the removal of the lifetime allowance charge. So in terms of sort of the process, the tests that go on for taking benefits in the current tax year, 23-24 tax year, there's not much changes to the actual process. It's just that the lifetime allowance charge itself has been removed. So that came in with the finance bill. Didn't actually get royal assent and become law until the 11th of July, even though say, it came into effect in April. So there were a couple of little tweaks around the edges on a few points between April and July, but nothing major. We then had a week's rest, and then we had the next set of rules. 18th of July, we had draft finance bill 2024 clauses. So this was the first sight of the legislation that will come into effect from 6th of April, when we don't have the lifetime allowance, so like replacing the lifetime allowance and those tests. It was not complete. It wasn't the whole picture, that was just part of it. That was for consultation. That was open until the 12th of September. So that is long closed now. You know, we did feedback to HMRC on that, along with lots of other people within the industry. We then had the autumn statement on the 22nd of November. There wasn't actually much detail in the autumn statement itself. What we got on the 22nd of November was confirmation that the changes will definitely be coming in from 6th of April 2024. They're not going to be delayed. There was a policy statement with a couple of little bits and pieces in it that came out at the time. But really the detail, and if you like, you know, seeing what they've done in response to the consultation on the clauses that came out in July, that only came out with the finance bill, which came out on the 29th of November. So finance bill had 100 pages of the finance bill in its entirety. It was longer than that, but 100 pages of that finance bill were dealing with the removal of the lifetime allowance charge, the lifetime allowance, I should say. So yeah, there's a lot of work gone into it. You know, it's a huge bit of legislation, really. Sounds simple when a politician stands up in March and says, "I'm going to scrap the lifetime allowance," but the reality of it, there's a lot more work to be done on it. So we have that, and that's sort of what I'm going to be looking at today. And this will, as I say, all come into effect from April 2024. So that is the implementation date that has been confirmed. Now, hopefully we're not going to be in the same position as we were at the start of this year, where we have a finance bill effectively, so draft legislation in April, and then we don't actually get royal assent till after the new year, after the new tax year, I should say. Hopefully we should get royal assent on the current finance bill, probably looking sort of mid-February time, we would think. So if there are going to be any tweaks, you know, we should know about it before the end of the before the end of the tax year still, and any changes, there should be a little bit of time at least to get things in place. Don't get me wrong, there's still an awful lot of work for us to do as pension scheme administrators, and obviously for you talking to your clients as well. Before that April deadline, it is very tight, but yeah, we should have final rules before then. So yeah, on that theme, really, anything I say from now on, I will make a comment that it is draft legislation I'm talking about. So it is subject to change. I think the main themes, the key points, how they're going to do things, aren't going to change before it becomes law. There's a little sort of bits and tweaks around the edges where there might be little bits and pieces, some little bits that maybe haven't been drafted quite as intended, especially in the bits of legislation that are brand new, so that weren't in the July paper because they've had a consultation on that, so they're probably less likely to change. But the new stuff that we've had that's not been consulted on, that's probably more likely to have changes in than the rest of it. So looking ahead then to the new world after April, what's taking benefits, having tests, what's it going to look like? Well, the benefit crystallisation events as we know it, they are all going to be scrapped. There will be no more tests when you take income from a pension scheme. So taking scheme pension, buying an annuity, designating funds for drawdown, there will not be any test on those. There will no longer be any age 75 tests, but we will still have some benefit crystallisation events, but they will now be called relevant benefit crystallisation events, so RBCEs instead of BCEs. And basically these are when you take a lump sum. And there will be two limits which we'll look at, which is when pension benefits are tested against these new limits. And I say both of them, they relate to lump sums. Protections will still be important in the new world. So, clients who've got any protection at the moment, it's still worth them having that going forward. There will still be advantages, so we'll look at that. One of the new things we've had that we haven't seen before this finance bill is the transitional arrangements. So I'm sure you will all have clients that have already taken some benefits. So it's, how that impacts the availability of the new allowances after 6th of April. So we'll look at that. And then we also have, so there's two main limits. There is a third limit technically, which relates to transfers to cure ops as well. So I'll just have a quick look at that to finish off with. So the new limits then to start off with. First of all, we have our lump sum allowance, or LSA. There are some places in legislation it calls it lump sum allowance. There's some places where it calls it individual lump sum allowance. So you may see ILSA or you might see LSA. Basically, they're talking about the same thing. Your lump sum allowance is £268,275, i.e. the same as the limit on the PCLS that you can take at the moment. Effectively, is 25% of the current LTA. So it is a familiar figure. That figure is written in legislation, just purely as a numerical figure. There is absolutely nothing in there about it being indexed. There's nothing about it being reviewed at any point in the future. It is literally just those figures written into legislation. So no plans for that to change anytime soon. So an individual will have a lump sum allowance, and any PCLS that they take and the tax-free part of any UFPLS payments they take will be tested against their lump sum allowance when they take it. The next bit on here about your tax-free bit of trivial commutation, winding up and small lump sums. This has changed since the July legislation. It's one of the things that's changed part of the consultation. Previously, they had said that this was going to use up your lump sum allowance. Now they are not going to use up your lump sum allowance. So trivial commutation and winding up lump sums, you have to have some lump sum allowance available, but it doesn't use it up, which is the same as it is really now with the LTA. You have to have some LTA available, but it doesn't use it up under current rules. And small lump sums can still be taken. So it's kind of trying to keep par on that one, really. Once your lump sum allowance has been used up, anything else you take above that is going to be subject to income tax. In circumstances when that is the case, subject to income tax, if the person who's receiving that happens to is a high earner and they have so they come under the tapered annual allowance, making contributions, that income won't count as income for tapered annual allowance purposes. And that was confirmed in the policy statement. Okay, so that's our first allowance, the lump sum allowance, and this is going to be the biggest one that you're going to have to think about with your clients. So the lump sum allowance 268,275, basically they use it up whenever they take PCLS or tax-free part of any UFPLS payment. So most of the time it's just going to be, you're going to worry about this for PCLS payments. The second allowance that we have is what's called the lump sum and death benefit allowance, or LSDBA, and again sometimes you might see this written as ILSDBA or ILSDBA or something, however you want to pronounce it, which just means individual lump sum and death benefit allowance. And again, another familiar figure to you, 1,073,100. I think quite a few of us wish they could have rounded it when they're keeping it as monetary figures. That figure, again, written in legislation, nothing in it about indexation or being reviewed or anything like that. So when a member dies, then there is a lump, when a member dies, if a lump sum is to be paid out on their death, so death benefits paid out as a lump sum, then any tax-free lump sums already tested against the LSA are tested again. So basically, it gets used up by both in your lifetime and any lump sum death benefits. Serious ill health lump sums are tested against the LSDBA as well. So serious ill health lump sum is the only lump sum that can be taken in the lifetime that doesn't get tested against the LSA but does get tested against the LSDBA. So again, it's fairly rare. Hopefully you don't see many clients that have serious ill health lump sums. I mean, they're only really relevant if people are terminally ill before the age of 75. And again, once you used up your lump sum death benefit allowance, then anything above that limit is taxed as income. But again, it doesn't count as income for the tapered annual allowance purposes. It's probably easiest to explain this with an example how this works in practice. So we'll have a look at John, who's 65 years old. He's got a DB pension and he's got a SIP. He starts his scheme pension, taking £12,500 a year, and at the same time he takes PCLS from that of £37,500. So the tests that are carried out at that point are both, we have to test against both the LSA and the LSDBA. So because this is the first relevant benefit crystallisation event for John, he has his full allowances available. So it's his full LSA of 268,275 and his full LSDBA of 1,073,100. The PCLS payment of 37,500 is tested against both those limits in his lifetime, and then he has the balance left over for future events. Now, when this first came out, we were kind of wondering a little bit about why you would have to test against the LSDBA in the lifetime, because if you've got LSA available, you're always going to have LSDBA available, you would think. And the only circumstances where we think that, you're going to use up the LSDBA first is if you had a serious ill health lump sum. So if somebody took a serious ill health lump sum first, and then after that tried to take a PCLS, then yes, you would have used up you could have used up your LSDBA first. That's a very unusual scenario, I would suggest. So the vast majority of your clients, when you are thinking about the limits and the tests that go on in a lifetime, you really only need to worry about the LSA, the lump sum allowance. You don't need to worry about the LSDBA in their lifetime. The important thing is, under the new regime, is there is absolutely no test for scheme pension. So taking scheme pension doesn't use up anything at all. It is just the lump sums that are tested. A couple of years on, John's 67 now. Doesn't look like he's aged at all. His SIP value is £600,000. He takes his PCLS from that 150,000, and he designates 450,000 to draw down. So at that point, okay, we look at his lump sum allowance, we look what he's already used at age 65. we look at what he's using now, he's still within his lump sum allowance and his LSDBA, and so he can take that all tax-free. That is fine. The important thing to note here again is there is no test for its drawdown. Your drawdown doesn't use up any of your allowances. It is purely on your lump sum. So that's reasonably straightforward to say. You really only need to be concerned about the LSA on that. Now, one of the questions that came out quite early days after the announcement, when we knew that you were going to have a PCLS as a monetary amount, this lump sum allowance is a monetary amount rather than a percentage of a lifetime allowance, is whether that gives more flexibility with taking PCLS, and particularly in the scenario where somebody has DB and DC benefits, where if you haven't taken maximum PCLS from a DB scheme, can you take up the extra from DC instead? And the answer is yes, it does give some more flexibility. It's not completely flexible, but in some circumstances that could be the case. So I've got a few examples on that next. So the first one is an example where somebody's got 400,000 DB pot, they've got a SIP of 1.2 million. Now, if they take their DB pot first, they can take up to 100,000 from the DB, PCLS, may involve, commuting some scheme pension, depending on the scheme. If they did that and took their DB pension first, that would then leave, that would use up 100,000 of their lump sum allowance, and then it would leave 168,275 left over, which they could then use to take the PCLS from their SIP. That's how it works now, and you can still do that going forward. That would be fine. But what you can do, or you will be able to do after 6th of April, which you can't do now, is actually access your DB pension first, start your scheme pension, but don't take any PCLS from it. Because you're not taking any PCLS, you're not using up any of your allowances. So you have your full 268,275 lump sum allowance still available, and so you can take all of your PCLS from your SIP instead. And it might be, you start your scheme pension at age 60 or whatever, and you don't take your PCLS from your SIP for another 10 years or something. That would be fine. You would be able to do that. But obviously that is quite a change from current rules. But if you look at the scenario where here we have like £800,000 in each, again, now you can take your PCLS from your DB first, and then you have the balance of your lump sum allowances available to take your PCLS from your SIP. Or what you could do is maybe just commute some of your pension in the DB pot and just take a smaller amount of PCLS, so enough that you're not going to lose any PCLS, but means you can take more of it from the SIP. In this example, it would be 200,000 on that. So there is a little bit more flexibility. But on the second one, you can't take, if you take nothing from your DB pot, then you're not going to have enough in your SIP to take all of it on there, because you are still restricted on your PCLS of this permitted maximum. Now, at the moment, we always think of your permitted maximum on your PCLS being 25% of your funds crystallised up to the available lifetime allowance. The principle is pretty much the same under the new regime, but it's worded differently, because you're not crystallising as such, your income anymore. It's not 25% of the amount crystallised. It is now going to be a third of the amount you use to provide an income, whether that is a third of the amount you put into drawdown, a third of the amount you use to buy an annuity, and then your scheme pension is basically it's a calculation. It's fairly similar. It's the same idea basically. It's a third of the value that you put into for use of scheme pension. That's how much you can have as your permitted maximum is the applicable amount. So your permitted maximum is the lower of this applicable amount, your available lump sum allowance and your available LSDBA, but I say in most circumstances the LSDBA is going to be irrelevant. So it's basically a third of the amount you're using to provide an income up to your available lump sum allowance. So looking back to sort of like, this question of flexibility between DB and DC and taking your PCLS. So, you know, if you had a DB pot of 400,000, SIP of 1 million, say the way it would work now, if you took the DB pot first, you take 100,000 from that and then take the balance from your SIP. But if you chose not to take a PCLS from your DB pot, it would give you more that you could take from your SIP. But it's still not enough because you haven't got enough to put into drawdown, in this case up to buy an annuity with, you know, in your SIP. You still have to have, you know, you can only have a maximum PCLS of a third of the amount you use to provide an income. So you have to have a big enough pot in order to get your PCLS out, even if you've got, you know, available lump sum allowance. So it does give you a bit more flexibility, but it's not completely, you can take it from whichever pot you like. Another example, if you have a DB pot 200,000, SIP of 600,000, with that one, it's like straightforward where you take your DB pot 25% first and then your SIP. If you didn't take anything from your DB pot, it wouldn't buy you any more PCLS in your SIP because you just haven't got enough in the SIP. So you would lose all of it if you don't take it. So that's not really any different to the situation today. So it does depend on the circumstances whether it gives you more flexibility. But there is another option with this, which, you know, isn't going to work for everybody, but there may be some clients in a situation that this does work for. So an example is if you've got a client who's 60 years old, who's got a DB pot valued around 500,000 and they've got a SIP of 700,000. So option one, you take your DB first, take your PCLS from that, and then have the rest of your PCLS from your SIP, how it would work now. Option two, under the new flexibility rules, you know, you could commute a smaller amount of pension from your DB pot. So you take some PCLS from your DB pot and then the rest from your SIP to make sure you're not losing out. You know, you're still getting the full lump sum allowance worth of PCLS out in that scenario. But there is a third option, say, which could work in some circumstances, which is actually, if you're 60 years old and you're still working, you could start taking scheme pension, but use that to fund contributions into the SIP to grow the SIP. So the example here I've taken is, you know, if the scheme pension was £25,000 a year, and they use that to fund contributions to the SIP. Now, when you take income from a DB pot, from a scheme pension, from a DB scheme, it doesn't trigger the money purchase on your allowance, so you're not restricted on the contributions you can make going forward. So you'd be able to put in £25,000, say, unless they were a very high earner and were subject to the taper. But that side, most people would be able to put in £25,000 a year. Whatever rate of tax they're paying on that, they'd get full tax relief on it, provided they've got at least £25,000 of earned income. That is key. They do have to still be working. They have to, you know, have earnings to justify the contribution to get the tax relief on it going in. But, you know, but if they have done that and they're still working, I did the sort of calculations this based on paying in £25,000 a year on top of your £700,000 SIP, based on 5% net growth. By the time you reach age 66, you've got £1.1 million in your SIP, which means you can then take your full PCLS from your SIP. So you haven't, you know, you've not taken it from your DB pot at the time. You haven't got enough in your SIP, but actually you could use it to increase it, so you increase your SIP value to the point that you have got enough, so you're not losing out on PCLS, but you're not commuting scheme pension either on that. So that's just one idea which might work for some people. Next thing we've got here on PCLS. Now, again, this is new. This is something that's new in the November finance bill. And this is a change from the July draft legislation that we had. Back in July, we were looking at being able to pay PCLS above the pertinent maximum, but it would be subject to income tax. So effectively, you could have PCLS payments that weren't completely tax-free. And really, the idea of this, the reason why they're looking at this is they're looking for ways for DB schemes to be able to pay out what effectively at the moment is a lifetime allowance excess lump sum. It's basically to pay out an equivalent under the new rules. And that's what they were trying to do by letting you have a PCLS subject to income tax, I say in the draft legislation in July. But the problem with the way the legislation was written, which we pointed out, and I'm sure many other people did too, was the fact it actually gave you the ability to take your whole DB pension as a lump sum, just subject to income tax. So they've scrapped that now. They've got rid of that idea. PCLS will still always have to be completely tax-free, or it's not a PCLS payment. But what they've added in is this new pension commencement excess lump sum. Now, this is only available when somebody has used up their lump sum allowance. And you still have to put funds to provide an income, and then 25% of it can be a PCELS, but it is subject to income tax, and it's to allow, it's for DB schemes to pay lump sums over the available PCLS. I mean, it's not the legislation doesn't specifically have to come from a DB scheme, but you just don't need to have it in a DC, because you could just do flexi access drawdown and take it as a lump sum, or there's other ways it can be paid out. So you only need to do it because of DB schemes. Okay, moving on to death benefits then, and good news. So back in July, though there was nothing on, back in July, the draft legislation only dealt with lump sums and taxation of lump sum death benefits. But in the accompanying policy statement in July, it stated that if you had uncrystallised funds that on death before age 75 were used to provide a beneficiary's income, but they were going to be subject to income tax, which would have been quite a big change, and definitely a big planning issue. Now, fortunately, we have had confirmation now that that is not the case. So with death benefits now, the only test that applies is lump sums. Again, like in life, same in death, it's only lump sums that you're going to be tested against the lump sum death benefit allowance. There is no tests when it's used for beneficiary's income, no tests at all, and it is still tax-free on death under 75. So that is good news, definitely. You know, that's one of the big things we've been concerned about, and there was going to be a big change. So broadly speaking, there's not been a big change in death benefits to the tax treatment of death benefits. What this looks like, prefer it in the table form, is so if the member dies before the age of 75, if it's paid out as income, beneficiaries take it as income, there is no test. It is all completely tax-free as long as you pay out within the 2 years, or designate it within the 2 years. And you could have £5 million in your pension, and it's going to be tax-free on that. And you can keep in the wrapper, for however many years you want, and then when you take the income, it will be tax-free. It's only when we have lump sums that there's potential to be taxed if death occurred before 75. So it's tax-free up to the lump sum death benefit allowance, and I think over that is subject to income tax for the beneficiary, whoever's receiving it. And then if it's death over age 75, then it's always taxed. Obviously, there's still advantages of it being used as income, staying in the tax wrapper, and then you can manage the withdrawals with tax limits and things, rather than having it paid out as a lump sum. But either way, it is taxed on that. So going back to John, who has now sadly passed away at the age of 73. At this point, his drawdown fund is worth £560,000. His beneficiaries decide to take that a lump sum. He did have a DB pot, but that's paying a spouse's pension, so you don't have to count a dependent's pension. You don't have to count that. On death, if your beneficiaries were taking it as a lump sum, then you just test it against the lump sum death benefit allowance. You deduct the amounts of lump sums the members had in his lifetime first. So this was the 37,500 when he took that from his DB pot, 150,000 from his SIP, and then we've got the lump sum payable on death. If we pay that out, it's still within his LSDBA, so that can be paid out tax-free on that. The other quick point on death benefits is that the July legislation, we now know, contained a mistake. It did look a bit odd at the time. The July legislation was said that even if you were over 75, your lump sum could be tax-free up to the LSDBA and only taxed above it. They have corrected that now. So if you're over 75, it will be taxed. Regardless, you say we don't even need to test it against the LSDBA if you're over 75, it will just be taxed. So key point really around death benefits is to make sure that the beneficiaries have an income option wherever possible. Now, there may be some DB schemes, for example, where that's not possible, but certainly for SIPs, you should always be able to make sure the beneficiaries can take income. So, because it can make a big difference, especially on death under 75, but there's advantages even over 75. And I think it's just become more important than ever, this, because previously, if somebody under 75 had died with uncrystallised funds and that was over the LTA, you couldn't avoid having the tax charge. It was the lifetime allowance charge. It's this year is income, but going forward, you can avoid it completely by taking income on death under 75. So, you really need to make sure your clients have the appropriate nominations in place. Now, if there's a dependent, the good news is a scheme administrator can always pay death benefits as income to a dependent, even if they're not nominated. If you can establish that they are a dependent, that's always an option to pay dependents, flex access drawdown as it would normally be. But if they've nominated people, otherwise somebody has to be a nominee. So if your clients have filled in one of our expression of wish forms that we've had since 2015, when the rules changed, then they will be fine, because the way it's drafted, we can nominate people that they have effectively nominated all family members on their form, but obviously that's not the case with all providers. The most common scenario where this might be a problem is if you have a couple, usually a wealthy couple, who have nominated each other to receive their death benefits, and one of them dies and the other one says, actually, I'm independently wealthy, I don't need this money, I would rather you give it directly to my child, who's an adult child and therefore not a dependent. In that scenario, if that child hasn't been nominated, and I say, if you haven't filled in one of our expression of wish forms, if they hadn't been nominated, but because there is a dependent there, the scheme administrator can only pay benefits as an income to that dependent. They could choose to pay death benefits to another beneficiary, to the adult child. That's fine, but they would only have the option of taking it as a lump sum. There could be big tax implications on that if it is a sizable pot. So yeah, really the key thing to say is just make sure that you always have the nominations in place, and so beneficiaries have the option of taking income, because if that's the case, you never have to worry about the lump sum death benefit allowance. One last point on here, that any funds that are crystallised under the current regime, so before 6th of April 2024, won't be tested on death against the LSDBA. So if you do have schemes, where lump sum is the only option, death benefits, and if they've started taking benefits before 6th of April, then that won't be tested again, so you won't have to worry about it. Yeah. So there has been a sort of question about whether people should like designate funds to draw down, should crystallise funds before 6th of April, if there's going to be any advantage of that. And so you could say, well, actually, yes, if you put funds into drawdown today, then it's not going to be tested against the LSDBA after 6th of April 2024. But say if you've got your nominations right, and so they can take income, then it doesn't matter really from that sense on that one. Okay, moving on. Protections. So protections are still going to be relevant from April. The way they've done this then, so for fixed and individual protections, they broadly continue as they are now. So whatever your protected PCLS amount, that becomes the protected LSA, and your LSDBA increases to the amount of the LTA protection. It is possible still to apply for fixed protection and individual protection 2016. They have put a closing date on it now for 2025. But for FP16, you can't have made any contributions since 2016, and that continues to apply. So if you apply anytime since the date of the budget, FP16 isn't as good as it is if you applied before the budget, because anybody that had it in place on the date of the budget in March from 6th of April this year can make contributions without busting it. If you apply after the date of the budget, then it does break it still, so you can't make contributions going forward, so it's not quite as good really. IP16, you can make contributions, there's no worries there. The problem you have if you're going back is that you need a value fund to value the pension funds as at 5th of April 2016, which is quite a while ago now, so it might not be that straightforward depending on what schemes they've got. So the levels of protections then, I say you simply substitute in the protected PCLS and that gives you your protected lump sum allowance. So it could be as high as 450,000 for the FP12, and depending on the different levels. You also do have the increased LSDBA, but as I said, if you've got your nominations right, you probably don't need to worry too much about your LSDBA. Planning points around this then. So anybody with fixed protection can now make contributions and they will keep that higher level of PCLS protection. Auto enrolment, they might want to opt back into it now if people have opted out because they've got protection, they can opt back in. The really big opportunity, I think, is for people who've had pension debits but still hold the protection that they can rebuild their pensions. This is what will be the most valuable. So I have an example of somebody who holds fixed protection 2012, which is 1.8 million, and they had a pension debit. So pension debits are when people get divorced, they have a pension sharing order put in place, and so one party pays out, so that pension gets transferred. Pension debit comes out of one scheme and goes into a pension credit for the ex-spouse. So in this example, if we had somebody who had a pension debit a couple of years ago, in June 2020, and their fund value, which might have been, I don't know, 2 million or whatever it could have been, gets reduced down to £1 million, that they can now start rebuilding their fund. So in the past, if they'd made contributions, it would have broken their protection. Now, if there were if your fund had been, it depends on the level of reduction in your pension as a result of the pension debit. It may have been that you were, after the pension debit, you were nowhere near the lifetime allowance and therefore you've made contributions and broken your protection anyway. But in this example, £1 million, you're pretty close to it anyway. You'd probably have kept your protection, and had growth would have got you over it rather than busting it. But now, yeah, you have this opportunity to rebuild. So as long as you've got earnings, so relevant UK earnings for making contributions personally, or you've got an employer that can make contributions, you're going to have maximum carry forward available because you can't have made any contributions in the last 3 tax years unless you've lost your protection already. And you can build it up and say in this example, you can build it up and get all the way up to your PCLS maximum of 450,000. And anything else you take, you're not going to have a lifetime allowance charge anymore on it anyway. When you take it out, it's just subject to income tax, or it can be left in your pension and passed on. So there's definitely an opportunity there. Primary protection. So anybody who's got primary protection will have a protection factor stated on their certificate. For primary protection, the lump sum allowance is straightforward, £375,000, which is based on the 1.5 million original lifetime allowance that we had back in the 2006. So that doesn't change. The LSDBA will be your 1.8 million increased by whatever your primary protection factor is on there. So it might not always be that relevant, but that's the way it works. Enhanced protection, always a little bit more complicated. If you have an enhanced protection with no lump sum protection, then it's the straightforward 375,000, the same as with primary protection. If lump sum protection was held in conjunction with enhanced protection, then for PCLS purposes, the maximum, for PCLS purposes, your lump sum allowance will be the maximum PCLS you could have taken on 5th of April 2023. So this was rules that they put in already in this year's Finance Act, limiting the amount to the 5th of April 2023 value. They have now put in another cap, if you like, on the LSDBA, restricting it to the amount of lump sum death benefits that could have been paid out on 5th of April 2024. So obviously if they're paid in this year, then that would increase that value. But I say in most circumstances, your LSDBA is probably not going to be that relevant. So again, planning opportunity, again, enhanced protection. If people are still working, you can now make contributions, use carry forward. And again, if they're in a situation where they've had a pension debit similar to with fixed protection, they can now rebuild those pensions. Okay, last little bit on enhancement factors then. Last little bit on the transitional protections, I suppose I should say, protections. So enhancement factors, these are basically, there's an international enhancement factor and a pension credit enhancement factor. So the international enhancement factor was when somebody transfers in a pension from abroad into a UK registered pension scheme. So they haven't had the benefit of UK tax relief on their contributions because they've gone into an overseas pension scheme. So when that comes back to the UK, you get an enhancement factor to your lifetime allowance. Similar situation if you get divorced and you have a pension credit, but that pension credit relates to benefits that have already been tested against the lifetime allowance. So the original pension scheme members have taken PCLS already. It's been tested against the lifetime allowance. It then gets transferred to their ex-spouse. They're not allowed to take any PCLS from it anymore, but because it's already been tested against the lifetime allowance, they will get an enhancement factor. So enhancement factors still apply at the moment and up to the end of this tax year. So you can still apply for them. And then you will have the deadline. So they apply till the end, till 5th of April 2024. And then you've got another year in which to apply for one. What it does, if you have an enhancement factor already, or you say you get one late into something before the end of the tax year, is it just increases your lump sum death benefits. And if you had a serious ill health lump sum, it would increase that because it gives you an increased LSTBA. It doesn't improve your LSA though. So it doesn't increase the amount of PCLS you can take. It only increases the amount that could be taken as a lump sum death benefit, which in most circumstances is probably not going to be applicable. And so you won't be able to get these going forward. So yeah, that's probably why they're not allowing any more. I don't think it makes that big a difference on that one. Okay, transitional arrangements. So this is for people that have started taking benefits already or take it before 6th of April next year, and then when they then have take more benefits under the new regime. So what we have is this standard transitional calculation. So it's basically moving, and it's all based on the amount of lifetime allowance you've used already. So if you've got clients that have used 100% of the lifetime allowance under the current regime, after 6th of April next year, they will have no lump sum allowance and no lump sum death benefit allowance. It will be zero. But otherwise, the lump sum allowance is reduced by an amount equivalent to 25% of the lifetime allowance used. So, for example, if you've got a client who's used 60% of their lifetime allowance, what we do is 25% of the 60% that they've used at the level of the current lifetime allowance. So 25% of 60%, so effectively 50% of 1,073,100 is £160,965. So that's how much their lump sum allowance is reduced by. So the available lump sum allowance now is £107,310. So it's reflecting the fact, the PCLS that they've already had, and basically it's 25% of the LTA used because it assumes you've taken 25% PCLS under the current regime. So therefore, it's effectively just taking that off your allowance for going forward. In terms of your LSDBA, so again, if you've used 100% of lifetime allowance, your LSDBA will be nil, but otherwise it's reduced by an amount equal to the appropriate percentage of LTA used. So if you've had a serious ill health lump sum taken before age 75, then it's 100% of that of your lifetime allowance that you've used. So, you know, if you've taken a serious ill health lump sum and used 70% of your lifetime allowance, then we'll convert that to a figure based on 1,073,100 and deduct that from your available LSDBA. The same for a lump sum death benefit. So this is like where a member's died. If one lump sum has already been paid out, lump sum death benefit has already been paid out, and now you're looking to pay another one, then you deduct the first one in full. But for most people, you can ignore both of those two, and you're just going to be looking at 25% of the lifetime allowance used again. So again, it's just being reduced by the amount, in practice, by the amount of the PCLS that's already been taken. So that's pretty much as you would expect, really. Makes sense, that does. However, there is an unless, which is around transitional tax-free amount certificate. So there is provision in the legislation that an alternative calculation can apply. Basically, it's if somebody hasn't taken 25% PCLS, if they've taken less. So most likely it's going to be, you know, from a DB pot, where they have chosen not to take PCLS, or the way that worked out, it's less than 25%, because the way it's worked out. So if they have appropriate records, then the member can apply for a transitional tax-free amount certificate, and they can apply to the scheme administrator of any scheme that they are a member of, and give them complete evidence as to the amount of their lump sum and death benefit transitional tax-free amount. Now, we've only just seen this in the legislation. There is no guidance with it. There's quite a few questions to be answered still over this. So I imagine, you know, we're getting questions on it, and I imagine a few of you have got questions. You've got clients in the situation where they've taken less PCLS previously, less than 25% previously. So it looks like there will be provision for it. In terms of what the complete evidence is and what can we receive, we are awaiting guidance on this. You know, we're asking questions, as others are within the industry bodies, about, you know, what we can accept, and the big questions, depending on how long ago it is, you know, if the scheme still exists, you know, about how they can get information, how they can provide evidence that they've taken less than 25% PCLS. But, you know, there is some provision in there. You know, if they've taken less, they will have more of their LSA available in order to be able to take more PCLS than otherwise. But there's an important thing to note on the bottom there, that even if, you know, you've taken, you took £1 million effectively out of, you know, as scheme pension and took 0 PCLS, you have all your LSA available. You would, in order to be able to get, you know, £268,275 out of the SIP, you would still have to have a SIP of £1,073,100 in order to be able to do that. It gives you back, potentially it will give you back your lump sum allowance, but you still have to have enough in your pension pot to meet the, you know, it's a maximum of a third of the amount used for pension income. So you still have to have the funds available, you know, to meet that requirement. So you know, maybe circumstances where people, yeah, they have taken less PCLS, but they just don't have enough funds in other pensions to actually make any difference. Yeah, so just wanted to say we're waiting on the details of this one and how it'll work in practice. But yeah, there's some circumstances where it'll work and others where it won't. Okay, last little bit to touch on is on international. So we've had the two main allowances: lump sum allowance, lump sum death benefit allowance. The third allowance is the overseas transfer allowance, or OTA, which is where you're doing a transfer from a UK pension scheme to a cure ops that will be tested against the overseas transfer allowance, and the amount of that is equal to the member's lump sum death benefit allowance. Where the allowance is used up, any excess is subject to the overseas transfer charge at 25%. So that would be deducted at the point that the scheme is transferred to the cure ops. We already have overseas transfer charge, which will continue to apply the circumstances it does currently. So generally speaking, if you're transferring to a cure ops, the member has to be resident in the same country as the cure ops. Otherwise, the overseas transfer charge applies. Or it could be that the scheme is in the EU and they're moving to another country within the EU, that's fine. But, you know, if you were going to move your pension scheme, you wanted to move to a cure ops in Malta and you're actually going to Australia, then that wouldn't meet the requirements, and so the overseas transfer charge would apply. So in the circumstances like that we have the existing rules where the overseas transfer charge to the whole amount, that continues to apply to the whole amount. It's only if the overseas transfer charge doesn't apply under the normal rules, then it could apply on the excess if you've used up your overseas transfer allowance on that. Okay, to summarise then, basically, the lifetime allowance, we have had confirmation now that it will be abolished from 6th of April 2024. We expect these changes to press ahead. The main point under the new rules is that only lump sums are tested, so you don't have to worry about taking income, whether it's scheme pension, drawdown, annuity purchase, beneficiaries benefits as well. It's only ever lump sums that are going to be tested. Death benefits are largely unchanged. That was really good news that came out. I think that's the big news, I think, that came out from the autumn statement and the finance bill, that we had feared they were going to change dramatically. They haven't. Really important now, making sure you've got your nominations forms in, so to make sure that beneficiaries have the option of taking income, especially if you've got large funds. Protections are still relevant. They will give you entitlement to higher levels of PCLS because it'll increase your lump sum allowance. And for clients that have previously crystallised, the new allowances are going to be reduced when they've used some of the lifetime allowance already on that. But that is all from me. So I do hope that has been useful. If we get more information, obviously we'll do some more updates. There should be an advisor guide coming out shortly, which will cover all of this as well. So, watch out for that on our website on the info centre. But otherwise, thank you very much for your time. Goodbye.